my knowledge of wars and genocide, different wars and genocides, basically give me this feeling of I felt really threatened, and my very first idea was to flee Ukraine. So, but at that time, two of my sisters were expecting babies, so I waited several days, and both of them gave birth to wonderful baby boys. And after those couple days, I took my 9-year-old son and I fled Ukraine.
Over the last few years, there have been so many videos on YouTube about the Ukraine war, the geopolitics of the Ukraine war, the military situation of the Ukraine war. But the interview I'm going to bring you today with Ukrainian historian Marta Havryshko is really something different, and I think something very special. Whatever your perspective on the events on the war in Ukraine, she is an historian, a witness to events in Ukraine, a refugee from the war in Ukraine. More than that, she is a scholar of the Holocaust, a scholar of anti-Semitism, Eastern European history of sexual violence, memory politics, and the violent far-right ethno-nationalism that has taken a hold in Ukraine in the last decade. Marta, thank you for joining me. I'm so grateful you have joined the Burning Archive for this discussion of what's going on in Ukraine.
Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome. I want to ask you about how the war's affecting people in Ukraine, I guess, primarily, rather than, causes and battle situations and all that sort of thing. And also talk about your work that highlights, I guess, ethno-nationalism in Ukraine, far-right nationalism in Ukraine, and especially what's going on with forced mobilization at the moment. But I thought maybe as a start, could you maybe just tell us what happened to you at the start of this war? Because you're a historian, and so I understand that you were on your way to work at the Babyn Yar sort of museum in Kiev. And what happened then?
Thank you so much for your question. Actually, I remember this, the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine very well, because it was a turning point in my life. I just came from Munich, where I held temporal research position at the Center for Holocaust Studies, where I was working on my book on Holocaust in Ukraine. So I came to Ukraine, and I was prepared to move to Kyiv to occupy a new position, Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, where I was appointed as director of one of the research institute. I had so many plans, so big plans, educational plans, academic plans. I planned to develop educational programs on Holocaust at Ukrainian universities. I planned book series and book presentations and talks about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, for example. But everything was basically canceled in one night when Putin started his angry speech. And from the very beginning of this speech, I realized that this is big war. And actually, in one night, all plans were canceled. And as a historian of World War II and the Holocaust, the first thoughts that came to my mind were the thoughts similar to the thoughts of Ukrainian Jewish women who experienced this German attack at Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, and many of them started to think what to do. And the main question was what to do, how to protect family members, how to protect your children, what to do basically, leave, flee, or stay and resist, and hope that everything will be okay. But my personal experience, my background, my knowledge of wars and genocide, different wars and genocides, basically give me this feeling of I felt really threatened, and my very first idea was to flee Ukraine. So, but at that time, two of my sisters were expecting babies, so I waited several days, and both of them gave birth to wonderful baby boys. And after those couple days, I took my 9-year-old son and I fled Ukraine. I fled Ukraine through Poland. Then I spent some time at Hamburg at the research institute where I used to work temporarily some time ago. And then I became a research fellow at the Basel University. And basically, I taught their course. A course about war in Ukraine and gender aspects of war in Ukraine, and that then I got a generous proposal from Clark University, where I'm basically now almost 2 years, and here I teach courses on anti-Semitism, racism, on Eastern Europe, and sexual violence in war and genocide, including Holocaust. And I'm still working on my book on sexual violence during the Holocaust in Ukraine. But my other side project is related to Ukraine, to current Russia-Ukraine war, to gender aspects of this war, and also I'm studying development of current far-right movement in Ukraine, ethnic nationalism in Ukraine. Why? Because it's heavily rely on the legacy of the Ukrainian nationalist movement from the World War II. They used most iconic members of current far-right movement, like Azov movement, for example, right, like Pravy sector, like Svoboda party. They rely heavily on the works of nationalist ideologists like Dontsov, Mikhnovsky, Lepinsky, and other, and they celebrate Stepan Bandera, Roman Shukhevich, and other very problematic figures. And they celebrate them as freedom fighters. And later, maybe I will discuss more on this issue, because it's not only those problematic figures are not only celebrated in some marginal far right groups, but on the very state national level. They became an integral part of this national myth that is instrumentalized for war efforts to mobilize society for the war against Russia. Because as we know, the main enemy of the Ukrainian nationalist underground movement was Russia, was communist Russia and USSR. That's why Ukraine state and Ukraine memory actors made this very clear link between the Second World War and between current event and current Ukraine resistance to Russian aggression.
Wow, I mean, you can sense there that you're a historian, you're witness, you're refugee. Like, as I
Yeah,
understand it, there's
yeah,
like more than 7 million Ukrainian refugees
yes.
since February 2022. But you're also sort of reporting, I guess, on current events as well through your X account, which there'll be links to below. But you've also been back. You still have friends, family, professional connections, and you visited Ukraine in recent times. I wonder, before we go into the specifics of ethno-nationalism and all that, and far right politics and all that, but what have been your impressions of how Ukrainian society is coping with this war, or not coping with this war, in your recent visits?
So I must say that I was raised in near Lviv, in
Mm,
very nationalistic surroundings, let's say. And from early years in my life, despite of very multi-ethnic background of my extended family, the prevailing ideology was Ukrainian nationalistic ideology. And partly because I believe, because we lived in small village, My parents built a wonderful house there, and we lived in this, small community. And as we know, in every country, small community means more social control and more social pressure. And this group dynamic basically had a strong influence on your behavior and in your daily life. So basically, this discipline was imposed on me from my childhood. That's why I was raised on this nationalistic myth about glorious, fighters, members of Ukraine underground movement, Ukraine insurgent army, UPA, and OUN, organization Ukraine nationalists, and they were celebrated in my school. We learned during my music classes. We learned all these, patriotic songs that were popular and crafted in Ukraine underground movement. So basically, this identity was the main identity that surrounded me from the very beginning. And I must admit that some part of my family was involved in Ukraine nationalist underground movement, and they were repressed. Some of them were put in prison, and some of them and their family members were sent to Siberia to special settlement. And every almost every our family gathering involved histories about Soviet repressions. And actually, the house that my parents built was on the territory, on the land that was seized by Soviets in 1939. And they remembered how they were stripped of everything because of this, decolonization and, this Sovietization and collectivization. So this memory was prevalent in my family, and it was the hegemonic narrative. That's why I was raised in this highly nationalistic environment. When I moved to Lviv, when I became a student at Lviv National University, Ivan Franko, actually I met almost the same atmosphere in Lviv. We know that Lviv is a very nationalistic city with the biggest monument to Stepan Bandera, and my place, my home was close to Bandera Street, Melnik Street, Konovalets Street, Shukhevich Street, and I used to walk my son to the school all on partisan streets. So I wasn't surprised, by all those developments during wartime. But what surprised me really, that after Maidan revolution in post-Maidan Ukraine, this very marginal, let's say, this very Western Ukraine nationalistic myth, historical myth, started to move eastward to Kyiv, then further, and and after 2022, it became really the national myth promoted on the very national level. That's why, for example, under President Zelensky, we nowadays we have streets named Bandera and Shukhevich in Kryvyi Rih, native town of our President Zelensky. We have in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, in Kharkiv Oblast, in Odessa Oblast. It's ridiculous, how this myth is cultivated in Ukraine, in wartime Ukraine, in order, to spark this national, uprising, to mobilize, the people. But last year, but another dimension of this very troubling development is that Nazi apology is flourishing. Why? Because many of OUN and UPA members of Ukraine nationalists on the ground, during the Second World War, they were members of auxiliary police under German occupation, and some of them occupied chief positions. So they were not just ordinary rank and file policemen. They were a chief of police, like Levkovich, for example. It's a very glorious figure in this nationalist pantheon. And those people nowadays are celebrated as freedom fighter, and their direct participation in the Holocaust is obscured, is marginalized and silenced, and even denied. And we have this from, adopting of this memory law in 2015, but now it's flourishing. And, last time I was in Ukraine last summer, I visited my family because my mother was dying due to cancer. And it was very important for me to spend last days with her. So I spent in Ukraine almost a month. And I visited Lviv, I visited my friends, relatives, and I made the several walks at the city center. And I was really shocked. I visited the prostor of synagogue, the space of synagogues where the Holocaust memorial is erected, wonderful Holocaust memorial. But there I saw swastika, SS bolts, solar cross, and right, several meters away, I saw, these fancy souvenir magazines with, socks, Daddy Bandera, and bags, Daddy Bandera. And I was just, I couldn't believe that this is happening, in the country which claims that fighting, against autocracy and for freedom and democracy. And
mm,
I spent in one day, I walked in the city center. I spent almost 3 hours in the city center, and I must admit that the amount of different hate symbols like SS bolts, like black sun, like Nazi eagle, like swastika, and different combinations of swastika, I never saw in my life, this concentration of these hate symbols. And I
mm,
used in past 10 years, I used to live in Austria, I used to live in Germany, in US and other countries, and never I saw, I live here in Worcester, in Massachusetts, almost 2 years in a row, and
mm,
I never saw even once Nazi symbol or other hate symbol.
mm,
While in Ukraine, it's so normalized. Why? Because it's a part of military culture nowadays. And those
mm,
symbols are adopted primarily by military actors, by soldiers. And because of the trust to Ukraine military is so high in Ukraine society, approximately more than 90% of Ukrainians nowadays trust Ukraine military. That's why they just accept this. And we know that Ukraine military nowadays is full of different far right groups. They are empowered. They are militarized. They are sponsored, and they are celebrated as freedom fighters. And we know one of the problem is that nowadays in Ukraine military we have overt Nazi apology. What I mean by that, for example, we have Nachtigall unit. This Nachtigall unit is named after Nachtigall Battalion, formed by German Abwehr, and this battalion participated in Barbarossa Plan and in attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, and it was led from Ukraine side by Roman Shukhevich. Former later he became a UPA commander,
mm.
and this unit,
And he's one of the more sort of notorious
yeah,
leaders
most
of
iconic
the
figure.
Ukrainian nationalist movement. Yeah.
Exactly. And later, from the documents of some participants of this Nachtigall unit, we know that they participated in anti-Jewish pogroms in Vinnytsia Oblast. They reveal this information is from their diaries,
Mm,
and for example, we have this, and commanders of this unit are very open about the very title of their unit. Yes, we celebrate our great grandfathers, and their glorious fight against, Soviets. Then another problem, we have Luftwaffe unit, and commanders of this unit explained, Germans, our most, devoted allies. That's why we borrowed their name. But they don't, but they not only borrow Luftwaffe name, but borrow Nazi eagle, not
mm,
the current insignia, but Nazi eagle that was appropriated by Luftwaffe in Nazi Germany. Another problem, Russian Volunteer Corps that was organized in spring 2022 is led by Denis Nikitin, White Rex, who is a neo-Nazi, and he was subjected to Schengen-wide ban in 2019 because of his extremist activity. He trained, for example, neo-Nazis in UK, and this organization that he trained, was banned and in Ukraine and listed as terrorist organization. And he's in his social media, he openly celebrates Hitler's birthday. He's open about his white supremacist ideas, and nobody cares. And he's invited by major mainstream Ukraine media,
mm,
mainstream Western media, and celebrated as freedom fighter. And
mm,
nobody pay attention to his views. And so basically this war, I mean, especially after 2022, empowers so many neo-Nazis and far-right groups, and they openly promote their agenda. They openly celebrate Nazi units. They openly celebrate Wehrmacht. Why? Because their ideology is those guys are lesser evil because they fought our eternal enemy, meaning Russians.
mm,
So, and they compare themselves with Nazis. So it's not Putin only who compared them with Nazis, but they themselves compare themselves with Nazis, and
mm,
it's ridiculous.
mm.
It's just crazy. Why do you need Nazi insignia to fight Russians?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This raises a really interesting issue, which we might come back to a bit later, which is how some of this extreme ethno-nationalism, I'm going to call it, but uh, might sort of spill over to particularly European societies, especially given Europe has had some issues with managing, integration of migrants and
Yes.
people from different cultural groups in recent years and a lot over history. um, but you raised the sort of statement from Vladimir Putin that part of the objective of the war is denazification of Ukraine, and that's been quite controversial from particularly in Western audiences. There's been a lot of pushback from that. There's been a lot of um, in a non-judgmental way, Ukraine supporters in the West have said, this is just Russian propaganda. You can't say everyone in Ukraine's a Nazi, that sort of thing. How would you describe the nature of the um, far right Nazi ethno-nationalist problem in Ukraine at the moment? I mean, you've already
Okay.
given some insights into it, but specifically, is it something people should be worried about?
Actually, I want to admit that this Putin's argument about denazification of Ukraine as his aim actually played a huge role in all this denial that is happening now in terms of Ukraine far-right groups, because
Mm,
people believe if Ukraine is a victim and Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression,
mm,
that you should challenge all talking points of aggressor.
mm,
And partly is true. You should be conscious that we are living in informational war, which is a substantial part of this war of aggression against Ukraine. And Putin, of course, he instrumentalized the memory and the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Of course. Why? It's obvious, for example, this obsession with the Great Patriotic War in Russia, the celebration of Victory Day. And they have this, in Russia, in many cities, they have this immortal regiment when
mm,
people crossing, marching across the streets, and they, carrying the portraits of their great grandfathers who fought Nazis. And what is interesting, from 2022, some people whose relatives died in the front line in Ukraine carried the portraits of their relatives, meaning they made a clear link
mm,
between this, war against Nazis and between Russian war against Ukraine. Why? Because it's in line with this official Russian propaganda about Nazis in Ukraine. And Russian official propaganda, Kremlin propaganda, tries to present this war as a, continuation of this war against, Nazi evil, and against those Nazis who are, in Europe, and they want to conquer Russia and all this stuff. So basically, it's a pure, instrumentalization and propaganda. But it doesn't mean that Ukraine don't have so-called Nazi problem. We know that Nazi groups are everywhere, basically, and now they are so empowered and now they are flourishing everywhere. But in Ukraine, there is Ukraine is very specific in this regard. Why? Everyone who is trying to you know to argue that Ukraine has no Nazi problem. For example, make arguments about this. The latest parliamentary elections when united Nazi nationalistic parties gain only 2% of voters. But the problem of Ukraine democracy, in quoting Marx, is that nationalist groups in Ukraine, they exercise power not through parliamentary, not through seats in the parliament. They exercise their power like nationalists exercise their power in Weimar Republic, in streets. They threaten politicians, they threaten prosecutors with violence against them and their family members. They threaten President Zelensky by developing, this no capitulation campaign against him, while they put pressure on him not to basically implement Minsk agreement that was partially a problem later for Ukraine that led to these complications with Russia. So basically, nationalists in Ukraine they even before 2022 they were empowered, because let's take Azov movement. It wasn't just some marginal political movements, some marginal party. This movement was sponsored by the minister Avakov. That they were sponsored by oligarch Kolomoisky. They got a lot of ammunition, a lot of uniforms, a lot of everything. They organized, Ukraine even before 2022 became a hotbed for neo-Nazis. The famous concerts of so-called nationalist, socialist, national, so Nazi black metal music were transferred from Hungary to Ukraine. And they were networking with different neo-Nazis across Europe, and they developed this idea of intermarium, meaning idea that European countries should unite and resist to both American imperialism and Russian imperialism. So they obsessed with this idea of white Europe, actually white Europe. They always refer to white Europe. That's why they are anti-Muslim, anti-Arab. They are also anti-Semite, because they believe they are proponents of this great replacement theory that the Zionist lobby that controls everything brings Muslim to Europe to weaken Europe and to emasculate Europe, and and they pose the threat to white women. They want to impregnate them. They want to weaken white masculinity. So all those conspiracy theories, all these anti-Semitic theories, they are still in place. And after 2022, they even developed. Why? Because we gain present with Jewish origin, and many people refers to Jewish background of Zelensky as an argument why Nazism can be in Ukraine. But for me, it's like an argument that there is no racism, systemic racism, and daily racism in U.S. because U.S. had a black president. It's the same argument, Under Zelensky, the first march commemorating Waffen SS Division Galicia that took place in Kyiv was in 2021. Before that, those marches were primarily in Galicia, in Western Ukraine, where basically Galicia, this division was formed by Nazis, you know. But for
mm,
the first time, under President Zelensky, it took place, you know, in our capital, in
mm,
Kyiv. And I want to pay attention to this Hunka Gate. Maybe our viewers remember that in 2023, a former member of Office and SS Division Galicia, Yaroslav Hunka, was given standing ovation in Canadian Parliament, and our President Zelensky, you know, was very happy to celebrate him. Of course, I believe that Zelensky wasn't aware who actually this guy was, but I am not sure if some, you know, Canadian politicians who are heavily involved in connections with Ukraine diaspora, especially those who have Ukraine background, like
mm,
Christian Freeland, I doubt that they didn't know who this guy is, you
mm,
know? So my suggestion is that it was their attempt to finally legitimize this, you know, heritage and legacy of Waffen
mm,
SS Division Galicia.
mm,
And what was the reaction of President Office? His, you know, team who is responsible for combating disinformation, they started to whitewash the Division Galicia. They started to release statement. Of course, Division Galicia wasn't involved in any crimes, but according to the Shen Commission, some members of Division Galicia members were involved in massacre in Guta Penятska, in
mm,
suppressing bursts of uprising, in anti-partisan actions in Slovakia, for example. What
mm,
does it mean, anti-partisan actions? It means fighting civilians, because
mm,
all partisan groups rely heavily on civilians.
mm,
And we know that, you know, Altiro Dal, while preparing this, you know, report for the Shen Commission in Canada, she indicated that those, you know, hundreds of former Waffen SS Division, Division Galicia members, they were not subjected to precise check, security check during
mm,
this procedure. So Canada just let them go because it was the Cold War. And we
mm,
remember how during Cold War, CIA and other countries, Miss Six, they instrumentalized Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe, from different countries, you know,
mm,
forest brothers from Baltic states. They even attempted to instrumentalize some people in Belarus, you know, without, of course, without major success. But Ukraine Nazi collaborators played a huge role in this,
mm.
you know, in these, you know, games during the Cold War. So nowadays,
Indeed, a Bandera was kind of taken out by the US effectively and
exactly,
supported post-war
exactly,
by the intelligence
exactly.
agencies
And, you know,
effectively. Yeah.
the Voice of America radio, you know,
Mm,
Hollis America, many people who work there, they have had connections with, you know, Bandera movements,
mm,
with, you know, Waffen SS. I remember in 2020, when I visited Ukraine church in Washington, I met some guy who used to work at Hollis Voice of America radio, and he approached me and asked me, what are you doing here? Oh, you're Ukraine, from this big Ukraine, what are you doing here? And I said, you know, I'm a fellow at the USHMM, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, because I'm studying Holocaust in Ukraine. And he said, you know, the, the Holocaust is a fairy tale. Do you know this? This is Zionist fairy tale, because, you know, Nazis couldn't have enough gas even to you know, to suffocate, you know, 6 million Jews. And I was like, you know, I was trying to, you know, to collect myself and, you
yeah.
know, to react in decent way, because I was new there, you know, and I was surrounded by all these, you know, nationalists, you know, people in Vyshyvanka and all this, you know, traditional clothing. And I was really, I felt really threatened, you know. Um,
Mm,
But he was introduced to me as very respected member of Ukraine community, who carry who is defender of Ukraine national interests, and so on and so forth. So I was shocked, how
Mm,
many people still in diaspora, they cherish this nationalistic myth.
mm,
And I remember at the same time I met one woman, and she told me, yeah, I remember during this Demjanjuk trial, remember this Nazi collaborator from
mm,
Nazi concentration camp who was accused of, he mistakenly was accused to be Ivan Grozny. He wasn't Ivan Grozny, but still, I recommend this film, Something Next Door.
uh-huh.
Documentary, remember?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Wonderful documentary about Demjanjuk. But what is really important, that he actually was a guard in Nazi concentration camps. And this lady told me, we used to make dumplings and to sell them after, after service, church service to Ukraine community, to raise money for his lawyer because he
Mm,
was innocent. And I was left speechless.
mm,
I was left speechless.
mm,
I
mm,
understand why Ukrainians were so, were so desperate to prove that he wasn't innocent, because it
mm,
was the entire issue of they struggle with this Russian Soviet propaganda about that wanted to discredit the entire Ukraine national cause, but at the same time they basically put their efforts in advocating real Nazi collaborator. And
mm,
according to many testimonies, he was really involved in real crimes, not just
mm.
he was basically willing executor of Nazi will.
And some of these, uh, well, this culture of ethno-nationalism, let's call it, is quite deep and long-standing. I mean, Ukraine has both a complex, rich history of cultural diversity, like as I recall it, I think Odessa, for example, used to have like, 30% Jews maybe pre
Exactly.
First World War, and like 100 different languages were spoken, and but also a very pretty dark history of anti-Semitism and ethnically based violence, not just against Jewish people, but against Poles, against Russians, against presumably Crimean Tatars. I don't know the
Yes.
specifics of it as well.
Yes.
And the Hemoniski
Yes.
massacres,
Uprising.
which
Yeah.
happened
Yeah.
in like 1640s, 1650s, which kind of plays a role in the sort of Ukrainian nationalist story of,
Yeah.
war of independence kind of thing. I recently read Simon Sharma's book on the history of the Jews in this period, and I think the statistic was about 90% of Jews who lived in what is now Ukraine, was then part of Poland, Lithuania, were either killed or forced to flee the country in that period as well. So it's got a. So what do you think is sort of driving? Because it's obviously not just a kind of a reaction to the events of last, you know, 3 years or the last 10 years. What do you think it is? Sort of, is it a sort of a victim myth, or what's sort of driving it? Do you think?
You know what is very interesting? Here in Massachusetts, I feel more at home than in Lviv.
Mm,
Why? Because I met here many of my students actually. They are descendants of those Jews who fled Ukraine during this wave of anti-Jewish pogroms in Odessa, for example, in at the beginning of 20th century, during civil war, 1917, 1921, and they are descendants of those people, and they preserve the memory of these shtetls, local Jewish towns, and we talk with them about their family stories, about this bigger picture of these events. And when I was living in Ukraine, those kinds of stories, they were so marginalized. They were never, spoke so vividly, so openly, especially in places where these massacres happened. For example, Lviv, my native Lviv. Before the Second World War, every a third person in Lviv was Jew. It was, it was city with such a great Jewish culture, with such a great Jewish history, with those wonderful synagogues. And when Soviets came, they started those repressions, and then this infamous Lviv pogrom of July 1st July of 1941. And recently I came across of one textbook, a school textbook that was published recently last year and was recommended for Ukraine public schools. And guess what? There is no mention of this pogrom. And it was not only Lviv, but major cities, Ternopil, Zolochiv, Drohobych, other major cities in Western Galicia that were anti-Jewish pogroms in summer 1941, where locals played a huge role. Of course, they were instigated, in most cases, they were instigated by Germans, because Germans wanted to use Ukrainian hands to do this, dirty job. They wanted to organize these so-called self-cleansing operations. They speculate on this Judeo-Bolshevism myth, on this, they blame collectively Jews for all Soviet repressions, and so on and so forth. They speculate on this Christian anti-Semitism. And because of so many locals were involved in this collective guilt is still present in Ukraine cities, and this memory is suppressed, silenced, and policing. I conducted dozens of interviews in those shtetls that had a substantial Jewish minority in Western Ukraine. And every single time when I was trying to raise question about Jewish community and what happened to this Jewish community, people started, to lower their voice. They were afraid. Some of them, even showed me some things that they took from Jewish homes, during the Holocaust, yeah, when Jews were placed in the ghetto, or killed by Nazis and local policemen. And it's a very difficult story. And many of those stories, basically, many of my informants, they even asked me not to indicate those stories and not to publish this, because they are afraid. It's a local community where we have a lot of these watchdogs, and their descendants, their children, their grandchildren are still living there, so they don't want to put them at risk. So even today, it's still so difficult to talk about this, but I believe this difficult talk is necessary, because we will never get rid of this anti-Semitism. What I observe in Ukraine, we have anti-Semitism on the rise because of the empowering of these far-right groups, and because of the Jewish background of Ukraine president. Many people in Ukraine started to believe that Zelensky is somehow connected to this, globalist, you know, this network of people who want to take Ukraine land, who want to kill all Ukrainian people, and take their possessions, take their minerals, take everything from them. you know every When society is in crisis, deep crisis, when society is poor, when society is threatened, like Ukrainian society, when people don't see hope, They are
mm,
trying to seek scapegoats,
mm, mm,
Jews over centuries were the scapegoats for so many people.
mm,
In Ukraine, ordinary people, even some of my colleagues started to share this nonsense about Jews, about thousands of Jews who are resettled from Israel after 7 October, because according to some unknown treaty between Israel and Ukraine, they want to save Jews. It's ridiculous.
mm,
And
mm,
people who are professors, who are academics, they share this nonsense. But
mm,
why? Because society is in deep crisis, and
mm,
because Nazi apologism is flourishing on the highest level.
mm,
Recently, I
mm,
came across, it was one exhibition prepared by Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the key memory agent in Ukraine Institute of National Memory. So they made this excursus in Ukraine history about military Ukraine history, and guess what? They indicated that the largest ethnic group in Ukraine underground movement after the second largest after Ukrainians were Jews, actually.
mm,
And
mm,
I was so surprised. It's a fairy tale. It's a rewriting
mm,
history,
mm,
and
mm,
nothing about hunting Jews in the street, in the forest.
mm, mm,
Nothing about kidnapping Jewish doctors from ghettos. I
mm,
remember my one of my interview with member of Ukraine Nationalists Underground, and I asked her about Jewish doctors because we know that Nationalists Underground, it was a great lack of doctors, so they kidnapped them from ghettos and they forced them to serve their interests. So I asked her about this Jewish doctor, and her response was, "Yes, we had such a great Jewish doctor." And he was always with guards. And I was so surprised. I saw that he was so respected, that he was, with guards. And I asked her, so what was the purpose? What was the task of these guards? And she told me, why? Why you ask? It's obvious. Because they're afraid that he will escape. Really? So nowadays they are trying to create these fairy tales, and they want to
mm,
present those, dozens, couple dozens of Jews, who joined ranks of Ukrainian nationalists underground for different reasons.
mm,
First of all, for means of survival, they want to present them, as the second largest ethnic group.
mm,
Okay, but if you are talking about this story, so if you say A, let's say B. And what happened to those doctors in the spring 1944? Many of them were killed. Why? Because the Red Army was approaching, and they believed that those Jews will betray them, and they will switch the sides.
mm,
So let's be open about what happened to those Jews, in
mm,
spring 1944.
mm,
And everything is so silenced, everything is so policing. And, the problem is that people, historians like me, who trying to challenge this, hegemonic narrative, this fairy tale, are persecuted, are bullied, are silenced, and are basically labeled as traitors because they
mm,
say, you are facilitating Russian propaganda. So maybe you are a traitor. Maybe you are, maybe Russians pay you. Maybe you are. I was labeled, as an agent of Mossad, agent of, Kremlin, and agent of Warsaw, and every single possible enemy of Ukrainian people. But
mm,
it's ridiculous. What we observe is the fascization of Ukraine education system in Ukraine and Ukraine military. But most worrying is education. In Babin Holocaust Memorial Center, for the first time in 2021, with the cooperation of the Office of the President, for the first time in all public schools, the center established and performed this, lesson of memory commemorating specifically Babin Yar.
mm,
Baban Yar tragedy that happened in September, the late September 1941, where almost 34,000 Jews, mostly children, women, and elderly people, were killed by Nazis. In Kiev, Baban Yar became a symbol of, a Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe. And but after that, when the Russian aggression started, it was the end of this. It was the end, basically, of this initiative. And what we
mm,
have now, we have our president who still commemorate victims of Baban Yar in the late September 1941. But at the same time, we have Nachtigall unit, we have Luftwaffe unit with Nazi Eagle. We have Vedmedi unit, which uses SS bolts and SS motto, "My honor is loyalty," as the official symbols.
mm,
And we
mm,
have a lot of, units like Karpatska, Sich, like Svoboda, like Vovki da Vinci, like Azov unit, Kraken, the Third Assault Brigade, which uses Nazi symbols, like, Derlivanger patch, this infamous Derlivanger SS division, very infamous, notorious for its brutal crimes against civilian population. Yeah, they use, for example, Volksangel, still, they use Totenkopf. It's ridiculous.
mm, mm,
Under Zelensky supervision, he is the
mm.
chief commander of the army that uses Nazi symbols. It's ridiculous. And I am calling all the time on Ukrainian commanders. Why are you doing this? How it helps Ukrainian national cause? I can't.
Yeah, yeah. I guess one of the things that's also, I guess, personally shocked me has been the way many in the West, in I guess political elites, cultural elites, but also just many ordinary people have either unwittingly or negligently sort of just you know uh, um, adopted some of these slogans and some of the sort of storylines, I guess, um, and in addition to, I mean, there's been a couple of very prominent historians talking about Ukraine, like Timothy Snyder and Sergei, is it Plocky? Yeah,
Okay, yes, from
yeah,
Harvard.
both.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, did you want to comment maybe specifically on those two historians, but also more generally the role of political cultural elites in the, let's say just broadly the West, just for convenience,
Mhm.
in in I guess giving some of these cultural behaviours a bit of a pass.
It's a very good question. I teach in this semester. I teach a course on war and genocide in Eastern Europe in modern time. So we cover 20th, 21st century and major wars and the genocides that happened in Eastern South Europe, including Balkan wars and so on and so forth. And what is very interesting, what we discuss in our class with my students, that in many of these wars, intellectuals were heavily involved in state
Mm,
propaganda, in state
mm,
war propaganda. Why? Because they perceive themselves, first of all, as activists, as citizens, as part of their national community, not as a professional who should, have some unbiased position. The concept of objectivity nowadays is questioned. We discuss our emotions explicitly in our research, the role of emotions, the role of our identity and background. We are very open about this, yes, and about our agenda, especially in this turbulent time when we have far right on the rise, and we should raise our voices as Holocaust scholars, for example, or genocide scholars, yeah, because we already
mm,
witnessed all this in the past.
mm,
But what is very important, that some intellectuals became a part of propaganda machine.
mm,
What I mean by that, I'm very grateful to many Western scholars who put Ukraine on the mental map of many ordinary people on the West.
mm,
Really, they explain that Ukraine is not Russia, that Ukrainian language is not Russia. They explain all this, Russophobia that nowadays is flourishing in Ukraine, and what could be the roots of this Russophobia. They explain a lot about, Russification in Ukraine. They explain about Holodomor. I remember, for the first time in my class, in my first semester here, when I asked my students, who knows about Holodomor, this Stalin-made famine in 32, 33, and only two people raised their hands out of 30 students,
mm,
and I was shocked, because this famine actually took life in Ukraine at least 4 million people, including, more than 1 million children. And I have personal stories in my family, in my extended family, of people who died during Holodomor. And when I listen to testimonies of Holocaust survivors from Kyiv region, or Cherkasy region, or Chernihiv region, or Sumy region, many of them mention Holodomor, even
mm,
Jewish survivors, because Holodomor, targeted every member of community, despite
mm,
of their, ethnic background or identity. Holodomor was, targeted some localities, precise localities. So basically, I'm very grateful to those intellectuals with, with that they basically put Ukraine on this mental map of Western people. But on the same time, I am very skeptical about their so-called decolonization and process in Ukraine, and national building process in Ukraine, because what they failed during in past 3 years, they failed challenge this ethno-nationalistic turn in Ukraine. They
mm,
failed raise their voice to protect, for example, me from the threat that I am receiving on the regular basis from
mm,
both far-right groups, members of Azov unit and their supporters, and from
mm,
respected Ukrainian scholars whose children are part of the so-called Azov family, and they keep
mm,
silence about this. I'm a
mm,
Holocaust scholar. I teach Holocaust. I teach anti-Semitism.
mm,
With my ethnic background, if you really care about anti-Semitism in Ukraine, you should be aware of what is going on. And many of these respected scholars actually, um, they know about my research. We are friends on Facebook with many of them. My posts are visible for them, and I even publicly call out some of them, and I ask them publicly, are you ready to take care about my son in case I will be killed by those who are not exist according to your narrative,
mm,
who are not exist? Because you are failing even to acknowledge this ethno-nationalistic turn and Nazi apology in Ukraine. Why you are silent about so-called, I call it, Hanukkah anti-Semitism in Ukraine? When during Hanukkah time, so many, discussions around, Hanukkah menorahs were in Ukraine, and many, intellectuals were involved in this. Many cultural figures expressed very anti-Semitic ideas about this, and I felt so uncomfortable. Here in Worcester, we had at least three Hanukkahs in different places in our city. We have we have a great Jewish community here. That's why here I feel more at home even.
mm,
I feel really more safe even than in my home city Lviv, where I spent my last 20 years of my life. And
mm,
when those outstanding scholars are silent about repressions against other scholars who study nationalism, is disgraceful, actually.
mm,
They are
mm,
harming not only people like me, but other scholars who are repressed, who are persecuted, who are fired in Ukraine, who dare to write publicly about far right, and then the next day, security service of Ukraine knock in their door. Why nobody from these, outstanding scholars said nothing about the fact that I was placed on this notorious website linked to SBU Mirotvorets. Mirotvorets is a very contradictional website.
Mm.
And we know
Mm.
that it was, call from U.S. State Department, from UN countries, from EU countries to shut down this website, because in the West, this site is known as a kill list. And guess
Mm.
what? They're evidence of my traitorous activity. When you visit this Mirotvorets, most of the evidence is my critic on my social media of renaming street after Bandera and Shukhevich, renaming
Mm.
streets after notorious members of auxiliary police, renaming streets after Bulba Borovets, who perpetrated massacre, anti-Jewish massacre in Olevsk and other region, when he was in
Mm.
charge there. It's my criticism, and they even put one of my academic article published in a very famous academic credible journal about Ukrainian nationalists on the ground and the sexual violence we see in Ukrainian nationalists on the ground as an evidence of my traitorous activity. So where
Mm.
are those voices? Where are
Mm.
those voices? They
Yeah.
are my
Yeah.
colleagues. They are intellectuals. They often talk that they care about fascism. They call out fascist tendencies, in Russia. And I agree with this. Okay, I agree with this. Very good. Because my friends, my colleagues in Russia, from, for example, from Memorial, yes, they are persecuted. They fled Russia. They afraid for their family members there. Yeah, it's great that they call out all these, all these repressions in Russia. But why are you silent about Ukraine? This silence is complicity. For me, it's complicity. They can't protect people like me and other intellectuals. People are paying, thousands of dollars just to escape repressions from Ukraine. They want to
Mm.
get out from this open air prison. You
Mm.
know,
Mm. Yeah.
it's unbelievable what is going on. And those intellectuals, they are complicit in this because they are keep silent about what is going on, about
Mm.
this very complex Ukraine politics. And they, of
Yeah.
course, silence about forced mobilization in Ukraine. Some of my
Yeah.
relatives
Yeah. Yeah.
were mobilized by force, and one of them lost his life 3 weeks later in his first battle.
Yeah. I can only express my admiration for your courage and integrity in speaking out
Thank you so
on
much.
these issues, especially given that kind of intimidation and, well, let's just call it intimidation for now, shall we? You mentioned forced mobilisation before. You said, Ukraine's in a real social crisis. This issue, again, is one of those issues that's a little bit sensitive to be raised in, Western countries. Um, but it came out in the famous meeting between President Zelensky and JD Vance,
Yes,
this is just my personal observation theory, but my sense of that when that meeting really went off the rails was when JD Vance sort of escalated from saying,
yes,
diplomacy or something like that to saying, I've seen videos of forced mobilisation and
yeah,
not acknowledging the fact that the reason these people are being mobilised is to, in part at least, to service American war objectives. But did
exactly.
you want to talk about, because you highlight this quite a bit on your X account, and it's it's disturbing viewing, but it's the kind of stuff that in a way people probably need to be aware of. Do you want to just talk about what's going on with forced
Yes,
mobilisation?
yes, thank you so much. I believe it's really a great problem. Recently I watched how my American colleague, well-known historian of Eastern Europe, visited Kiev, and she made a pause that such a freedom is in the air, such a freedom, and democracy. And I was like, what? Talk to people in the rural area. Talk to working class people who don't have money to buy their freedom, and they are turned into national heroes 3 or 4 weeks later. We know numerous of those stories almost everywhere. Nowadays we have these stories of people who are kidnapped in the streets, who are pushed in these military vans like garbage, like a meat, and they resist, and they and all these horrible pictures are in front of their crying children, in front of resistant mothers, in front of resistant resistant wives, and sisters. And what we know, for example, recently one of my friend, he became a deserter. He deserted from Ukraine army because he experienced some sort of PTSD, burnout, and we know that psychological support in Ukraine army is not very well established. So basically, he was arrested, and he was placed in very dirty place with other people who were blamed to be for with other deserters, and they were treated very badly, without sanitary products, without clean water, without proper food, without medication. Some of them were with wounds. You can't even imagine what is going on actually, and this is swept under the carpet, and nobody is talking about this. Nobody is talking about those people who do not who didn't receive appropriate training and sent to the front line, like my brother-in-law, who lost his life 3 weeks later after mobilization. And nowadays, the main problem is that Ukraine experienced the lack of manpower, and this problem is a major problem. That's why what we observe from the West, we observe push from Western countries, Western political elites, push to reduce mobilization age, draft age to 18 years, as you remember. Why? Because of the lack of manpower. But what is the solution from Ukraine government? They attract neo-Nazis and far right from around the world. It's one of their responses to this lack of manpower. They made improvements in the whole procedures. And nowadays, that's why, for example, nowadays I experience some death threats from far rights, from neo-Nazis, from US, from Argentina, and they serve in Ukraine military. They all serve in Ukraine military, you know. And this is one of the problem that Ukraine, I call it. This process is similar to Afghanistan. Remember when U.S. administration, provided weapon to mujahideen and called them freedom fighters, and as a result, we had these well-trained, Al Qaeda, Taliban, Osama bin Laden, and other, wonderful freedom fighters. And then they turned on their masters. What we observe now in Ukraine is very similar process, because all those far right nowadays they are attracted to Ukraine. Like every far right groups, they need military training. They are thirsty of access to weapon and military training. They want to have this war experience, because all of them have a dream to organize some race war in their countries, for example, or war against Muslims, or war against aliens, invaders, immigrants, so on and so forth. And they are welcomed in Ukraine nowadays. For them, it's a paradise nowadays. They receive NATO weapon, they receive social benefits, they receive economical benefits, and they receive diplomatic backing and media support. They are
mm,
celebrated as freedom fighters. They invited by mainstream Ukrainian media with all these swastikas, and Ukrainian journalists are asking, "Oh, you have such a nice tattoo. Please explain." And it's an Asian symbol that symbolize, and they started, these fairy tales. It's crazy. It's
mm,
crazy. Journalists are not doing their job.
mm,
Recently, as I told this, Polskie Radio, Polish radio. They made
mm,
this, a long interview with one of the Azov's third Assault Brigade freedom fighter, Kolovrat. Kolovrat means swastika, basically
mm,
in Slavic language. In post-Soviet space, it means swastika. So this guy has a big tattoo of Hitler on his chest. He is full of swastika. He was sentenced for 7 years in Russian. In Russian prison for attempted murder out of racial hatred. He
mm,
escaped from Russia in order to escape persecution. He became a ZOE member, and recently he made mocking jokes about Holocaust survivor in Ukraine, and they presented him as a freedom fighter.
mm,
So journalists in Ukraine and in the West are not doing their job.
mm,
They are not questioning them. They are not challenging them because they want to, to stick to this, major narrative. And their excuse is, we don't want to feed Russian propaganda. What about protecting human rights and democracy? What
mm,
about caring about those people who are threatened by those, militant, aggressive, well-equipped, well-trained guys with now PTSD? Because they
mm,
already have 2-3 years experience in war, and they endure a lot, and they are very aggressive. Every single day I receive so anti-Semitic, so misogynist and threatening messages from all those guys with swastikas on their social media, pictures. So basically, because of the lack of this manpower, because of the lack of motivation in Ukraine, basically Ukrainian society nowadays is very desperate.
mm,
Because after the presidential election in the US, and with the strong desire of Trump to put this war to an end, Ukrainians really afraid that they will be forced to give up, territories, and those territories will probably, be part of Russia. And many of them, because of this war propaganda, they really believe that this is existential war for Ukraine, and the whole Ukraine can be occupied. And war propaganda relies on fears, and
mm,
war propaganda feed this fear. They always, these propaganda actors, they make reference to Gulag, they make reference to Holodomor, to Soviet repressions. That they make what we historians call atrocity propaganda, meaning
mm,
they pick some stories about real Russian war crimes, and they exaggerate them, and they make them very magnificent, and they say, you see what will happen to you if we will stop fighting. That's why we have shaming of men in Ukraine nowadays who are trying to escape military draft. And what is very interesting, that this shame is developed in feminist circles, including feminist
mm,
circles, not only in military circles who are, who want to, to have a new soldiers, but also in feminist circles. And it reminds me, white father movement during the First World War in the Great Britain, when prominent feminists and ordinary
mm,
women, they publicly shamed men of military age, young men, in the streets, and they demanded that they will join military, join army. So basically, why it's I believe that in this way Ukrainian feminists, they betrayed their own cause, because they basically feed this very patriarchal narrative
mm,
about men as defenders and women who are always in need of protection. That's
mm,
why they reinforce these very traditional gender roles, you know But they explain to me that, they are so afraid of Russian occupation, so afraid of Russian repression, that they are siding with these neo-Nazis because they follow this concept of lesser evil. But I disagree with them. I don't believe, because Azov ideologists and ideologists of other far right groups in Ukraine are very open about their view on women rights. They
mm,
are very open on the rights of ethnic minorities, sexual minorities. They are very open. Just read their social media, just listen to their interview, or just ask questions, direct questions. And they are afraid to ask this direct question because they assume that the answers will be very not democratic and not liberal,
mm,
and
mm,
those answers will not fit this narrative about, freedom fighters who are fighting for democracy against this autocracy and against this, that the war discourse in Ukraine is very racial discourse. Basically, the
mm,
discourse is that Ukraine is a part of Europe and is fighting for liberal regime, for liberal democracy, and for human rights, and fighting against this, East hordes from East. Yeah, and they
mm,
often make reference to this, Buryati, Chechen groups, and all these, members of Russian military from Asia. Yeah, like
mm,
uncivilized, they are so barbarian. So Ukraine war propaganda can't even understand that they basically use racial, very racist discourse in
mm.
order to mobilize society for this war. They
Yeah,
use
yeah,
very racist discourse,
yeah,
and
yeah.
of course the question of atrocities of Ukraine military is of course completely absent, even after UN reports about, torturing of prisoners of wars, for example, even after some testimonies from Amnesty International or some Western media who report about cases of sexual violence from Ukraine's side. Complete silence. This is taboo topic. Nobody talks about this because nobody wants to undermine this bright image of Ukraine soldier, Ukraine
Mm,
defender. So we have war propaganda. This slogan, be brave like Ukraine, those decent, freedom fighters. This is, of course, fairy tale, and this is war propaganda because
mm,
we have war crimes in different sides. Of course, Russians are very cruel, and Russians are responsible, Russian military are responsible for many, many war crimes, crimes against humanity, and maybe even crimes of genocide in some cases. In some, this is task for legal scholars and for lawyers and
mm,
for further investigation. But yes, Russian military is involved, and I am very vocal about this. I wrote several academic articles and book chapters about Russian war crimes, sex crimes in Ukraine. But it doesn't, excuse those crimes. Can't be an excuse for Ukrainian, transgressions, let's say, and it can't
mm,
be excused for building this autocracy where Russian-speaking people are persecuted, where historians are persecuted, where political dissidents are persecuted, where political opponents are beaten and tortured in their prison, where churches of Moscow Patriarchate, Orthodox churches, are seized by, we call it titushka, it's semi-criminal groups, who are vigilance, yeah. It
mm,
can't be, in Cherkasy, recently at Cherkasy National University, one professor was fired because her daughter put a video on her social media criticizing Zelensky policy towards Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. And she was
mm,
fired. This is
mm,
political repression, guys.
mm.
Where are your voices about freedom of speech?
Um, yeah, absolutely. I guess, like I think I might have shared with you a recent video by or a sort of interview with Alexei Arestovich, who was the former
Advisor.
communications
Yeah.
advisor to Vladimir Zelensky, a current a current candidate for president, even though he's sort of out of the country at some unknown
Yeah.
destination,
Yes.
maybe with some oligarch support. Who knows? But he was saying quite explicitly that for Ukraine to get past the sort of social conflicts of this war, to recover from this war, that they Ukraine would have to find a way to sort of root out what he described as the I think it was translated as nationalist dugout, which maybe it's nationalist holdout. I'm not quite sure what the actual
Mhm.
Ukrainian word he used was, but um, and so I'm not saying endorsing that comment, but I guess I'm just
Mhm.
pointing to that as an
Mhm.
indicator that there's clearly people who are now thinking, how can Ukraine get beyond the state in which they are in now? And I guess I'm keen to maybe ask your thoughts about that, but I guess it's in the context of knowing, having studied a bit of history over the years, you would perhaps know this even better than me, that the end of a war can often be a time of both intense casualties on the battlefield, but equally a lot of retributive violence, a lot of sexual violence, or a lot of
Yes.
recriminations, a lot
Yes.
of refugees, a lot of social disorder, loot and pillage kind of situations, rape, loot, and pillage situations. Um, and I would, just as an outside observer, I'd be quite worried about at some point Ukraine going through really quite a bad social crisis over the next, whenever this war comes to an end. But what do you see as some potential paths out for, I guess, social reconciliation, or maybe is a way of putting it? Because you can have the leaders come to some sort of peace agreement, but everyone's had the experiences of the last 10 years, I guess, that you've been recounting in this interview. Yeah, how can people recover from that?
Actually, it's a very difficult question. It's maybe one of the most difficult questions because Ukraine society is deeply divided nowadays.
Mm,
Everyone fights with everyone. Why? We have so many lines of divisions across, ethnic lines, across class lines, because this war actually is a very class war. Because
mm.
most of those rich people, they paid bribes and they for exemptions from the military. For example, our persecutors recently was revealed information. Some our persecutors, some our politicians who were involved in corruption cases, mobilized themselves to the military in order to escape imprisonment. So for them, it's because they know that they will not be sent in as infantry, to
Mm.
Pokrovsk or other, hot spots. They
They'll
will
have a
be
desk
sitting,
job somewhere.
yeah, somewhere
Mm,
in Kiev,
mm, mm.
in some unit, and so on. Another question: many those vocal politicians, female politicians, for example, they send their husbands abroad, for example, and their sons abroad. Many sons of Ukrainian politicians, they study even here. We have sons of Ukrainian politicians. They study abroad. They enjoy their life. Yes, those who can escape draft and escape Ukraine nowadays pay 10, 15, 20, 25, 30,000 dollars. They sell their houses, even they sell their cars in order to escape from Ukraine. But who has this, money, and who has these possibilities, to receive some exemption, yeah, to pay those high bribes, and those bribes are getting higher and higher because of the lack of manpower. So only those who have some, resources. That's why those who are fighting mainly and those who are now mobilized mainly, they are working class people. They are
Mm.
poor people from countryside, for example. Many of them are abuse alcohol. They are heavy drinkers, for example. They abuse. They have some chronic diseases. Yes, they have tuberculosis. They have cancer. And according to international law, it's a crime against humanity when you mobilize people with severe medical condition. But nobody cares because
mm,
draft officers have their quota and they are threatened by by their superiors. If you not fulfill quota, you will go to the front line and your son will go to the front line. That's why nowadays in Ukraine it's a survival game. It's just a
mm,
survival game. And
mm,
this is one of the line of division, very great division. So the question of mobilization is a great division in Ukraine
mm,
across, across class line and across the line of military experience, because we know that those, romantic volunteers who joined ranks of Ukraine army at the beginning of the Russian invasion, nowadays entered fourth year without substantial rest, and they are so
mm,
angry. One of my
mm,
friends even was trying to escape while on training outside Ukraine in one of the
mm,
country where he was
mm,
sent, and he was trying to escape because he is full of this experience.
mm,
And we know that some soldiers even go in this, performative desertion, and they make it public in order to draw attention to the problem that they are exhausted by this war, and
mm,
nobody can substitute them because of the lack of manpower, because people are hiding, because some people, they make funny tragic comic video how they make, stockpiles in order to spend several months at home and not to go to buy bread and milk and medication, because they don't have a bribe to pay draft officers. So Ukrainian society is really divided across those lines.
mm,
We have a great resistance to forced mobilization. What we observe in Ukraine history, especially during the Holodomor and collectivization, we observe phenomenon of baby bunt, meaning women riots. When
mm,
women in their
mm,
gender roles, we are mothers, yeah, we
mm,
are
mm,
grandmothers, we are daughters, we are wives. We will use our gendered power, and we will defend our sons, our fathers, and so on. And they attack draft officers, and basically they rescue men using their power, this gendered power, because they
mm,
expect that they will not be attacked by those draft officers. And in most of the cases they are not attacked, but nowadays they started even use force against those women. So nowadays we have already one case when draft officer was killed even, while
mm,
friends of some newly mobilized men were trying to rescue them. So we have a lot of tensions within society. Those who stayed in Ukraine, for example, are angry at those who fled Ukraine, at
mm,
refugees. They say, "Oh, you don't understand. We are under constant threat, under constant shelling and bombing and Russian strikes. Every day could be the last day." And I understand this very well because both of my sisters with my little nephews are in Ukraine. My all family members are in Ukraine, in different parts of Ukraine. And every single time when Russia starts its strikes and drone attack, I am calling to them just to check on them. So I understand in which, tension, constant fear they are living. And
mm,
those who fled Ukraine, they really can't understand this fear. I remember last year, it was the second day after the funeral of my mother, and I was staying at her wonderful house. At 4 o'clock the strike started, and it was so close to the house of my mother that glasses on the windows were shaking, and I was so afraid that it will be the last day of my life. And I was like,
mm,
what? My son is in US. What I'm doing? I can't just die today. But this fear is very real. And
mm,
that's why people who stayed in Ukraine, they tend to develop this attitude towards refugees, especially refugees from Western Ukraine, as
mm,
that they blame them for treason, basically. Yeah,
mm,
they say you left us. Yeah, you don't want to endure. You don't want to be with your people and suffer the equal, and have the same experience. That's why a lot of misunderstanding. And I
mm,
remember when I was in Basel, and I was teaching. I took also my nephew with me, so I was single mother of two children in a new country, and I gave dozens of presentations in different universities about war in Ukraine and dozens of media interviews, and I was blamed by female refugees from eastern Ukraine, from Mariupol, from Kharkiv, for even being there. They blame you. What are you doing? You are not true refugee. And I said, no, I'm not refugee. I'm here for work, actually, because I never used those benefits of refugees. Never, because for me it's not appropriate. Of course, I had this contract signed even before the war with Basel University, and I was there for my job,
mm, mm,
but this tension between different groups of refugees even developed even inside Ukraine communities in these countries. So we have a lot of divisions. Also, we have divisions across language lines, because language is politicized and weaponized by many political elites in Ukraine. For example, Irina Farion, who was killed, Ukraine professor, who was killed last year in my native city, Lviv. She had an open conflict with Azov fighters because of their Russian language, because many of them are from Kharkiv, Kryvyi Rih, they are from
mm,
Dnipro, so they are Russian-speaking people, basically, yeah? And many
mm,
of their members are Russian citizens, ethnic Russians, so they use
mm,
Russian language. And they have open conflict across these language lines with her, and
mm,
as a result she was killed by, presumably, by a guy who followed all these neo-Nazi racist, groups, and his father, he's Russian speaking, and his father serves in Ukraine army, and his father is Russian speaking. So
mm,
basically, this language issue is very important in Ukraine. And we know that language issue heavily contributed to the civil unrest in
mm,
Donbass in spring 2014. Because after Maidan revolution, when all these nationalists, including Irina Farion, because at that time she was a member of parliament, from Svoboda, right-wing racist party, she was very vocal, and she was very radical against, she wanted to eradicate all Russian language. She labeled Russian language people as traitors of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So because of this speculation on language issues, we have a big division inside Ukrainian society. My son knows both languages, Russian and Ukraine, and
mm.
I remember when he was harassed, when we lived in Lviv, when he was harassed in kindergarten by his teacher because of using Russian words.
Yeah.
So, and today I can't imagine him using Russian language in public transport in Lviv, because he
Mm,
will be harassed at least, and he could be attacked like other people are attacked while using, Russian language in very nationalistic cities like Frankivsk, Lviv, and Ternopil, for example. So we have still these strong divisions that are supported by so many politicians who speculate on this and trying to make their political benefits, but it harms
mm,
Ukrainian society so much,
mm,
so at least we should put aside this ethno-nationalistic agenda. We should put aside, and also we should put aside this, anti-Russia project, because I believe if we build anti-Russia instead of building inclusive Ukraine with its national interest, if we will build anti-Russia, we will have war, for decades.
mm,
We will have war, more war, because Russia will not disappear. Russia is our neighbor. and we have a lot of connections with Russia, and I believe that yes, somehow, of course, there is a question of justice. Without justice, we can't build a substantial peace. And justice is not possible without reparations and acknowledging the guilt of Russian war criminals. They should pay for their crimes, for destroyed cities, for destroyed universities, libraries, for destroyed lives of ordinary civilian people, including Russian speaking people. Most of their victims are Russian speaking Ukrainians. Most of their victims, including children. That's why I believe, this reconciliation, this peace building process will be very, very complex. But I
Mm,
believe the main principle for this will be principle of human rights, inclusive society, multicultural society, tolerant society, without this, nationalism, and especially ethnonationalism, because it's very harmful. And we observe this in Ukraine nowadays in terms of these language wars, memory wars,
mm,
and all this, because it was one of the reasons of civil unrest in Donbass that has this obvious. Yes, we had Russian interference and direct involvement of Russian troops, like in the Baltsovo and the Ilovaisk, but the component of civil war was present there because many
mm,
local political elites, they felt betrayed by Maidan. They felt disrespected, and they felt threatened. Their
mm,
identity was threatened. Their Russian language was threatened. That's why, Ukraine should be more inclusive and should
mm.
build. New Ukraine should be built in more inclusive principles, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I really do hope that there are the people there in Ukraine who, and I guess many of the people who've fled Ukraine, like yourself, who are able to perhaps slowly rebuild a Ukraine on that much more sound basis. And just a personal view is it's been so tragic that um, you know uh, so many people, both in Ukraine and in the West, have sort of encouraged this tragic
Exactly. Yeah.
ethno nationalist violent path. It's just been an absolute
Yes.
tragedy. So
Yeah.
I do hope it ends soon. Marta, you've been incredibly generous with your time and your insights and your testimony, I guess, of this experience of war. Is there any last words you maybe just want to say to viewers out there, whatever people's views about the Ukraine war, about that you'd maybe just like to leave as a sort of a final sort of message?
My final message is nowadays in our turbulent time, we should unite our efforts in standing against all forms of bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, hate, and nationalism. Nationalism is a very destructive wave, especially ethnic nationalism. It's a way to violence, war, militarism, destruction, and losses. I really hope that we will stop, we will stop feeding this nationalistic agenda, and we will build peaceful life for our children, peaceful future.
Wonderful.
Yes. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Marta. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for giving space for this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta.